Okay, shall we start? Good. So the set of lecture was supposed to tell you a bit about some, let's say, classic results and methods coming from disordered system of statistical mechanics applied to machine learning and computer science. We went through a replica, the first lecture. In the second one, well, I discussed some applications for simple machine learning problems, linear regression, and kernel methods, mostly. And so today what I want to do is to discuss the twin brother of replica method, which is called the cavity method. Okay? So the cavity method was invented, well, essentially by Marc Mézard, Giorgio Parisi, and Michelangelo Virasoro. And actually, Virasoro just got the Dirac medal yesterday for something else. Don't worry, Parisi got it already, and Mark is probably on the short list. And so, thank Miguel. And, that was around the 80s, and the goal was to try to get the replica result without replica. That was actually the result of the first paper. And then, there was a revitalization or revisitation, if you want. Yeah, that was also the title of the paper, the cavity method revisited. By Marc Mézard and Giorgio Parisi at the early 2000, and at the time, all the cool kids in StatMech had to do this, and we were really all blown away. And incidentally, we were given the tools and we could solve everything. And of course, soon we discovered that we could not solve everything, but we had a fun ride for a while. Okay, so I want to tell you about it. Because it's good to know in complement to the replica method. Of course, I need to find an example. And so we are going to step away from machine learning for a while, and I'm going to discuss a computer science problem, in fact, a combinatoric problem called the coloring problem. So here is it. Let's say that you have n nodes, or if you are a physicist, spins. Pot spins. So a spin is plus minus 1. A Potts spin, named for Mr. Potts, is a variable that can take Q value from 1 to Q. Okay? It's a very good variable for something that has a color. If you have Q color, physicists will say, no, you don't have a Q color problem. You have a Potts problem with Q states. So we have n variable. They are Potts variable. Okay, so with value going from 1 to Q. And now we have m edges, or link. So you have a graph, something like this. So here n equals 3, m equal to 2, or 3 as well. Right, 3 links, 3 edges, 3 nodes. Question, can we color this with 3 colors or with 2 colors? And by coloring, I mean to draw, to color each node in such a way that if you are connected with someone, you have a different color. So of course, here it's easy. You can do a 2 coloring. Or can I? Okay, this is not 2 colorable. Fine. Maybe this is 3 colorable. Indeed, this is 3 colorable. So that's a click, a 3 click. And now we see that a 3 click needs at least 3 colors. Okay? So the theory of how to color graphs is actually one of the most important problems in optimization, in discrete optimization. And people have been looking at it for a while. And of course, this is an NP-complete problem. That means that if you have a generic graph, we don't know of any algorithm that is guaranteed to give you a proper coloring in polynomial time. We don't even know how to know if there is a proper coloring in polynomial time in the worst case. Okay? It's as hard as it gets. And it's NP-complete, which means any other NP-complete problem that you have heard about can be mapped to this. Okay? Now, the version that we would like to consider is the following. you look at the GNP ensemble. So the GNP ensemble is a set of Erdős-Rényi random graph. Actually, I'm not looking to GNP, I'm looking to GNM. Sorry, very similar. So these are Erdős-Rényi graph. I'm just taking n nodes, and I'm drawing m links randomly between all these nodes. Okay? So if you draw a graph from GNM, the average degree, that means the average connectivity, so if you pick one guy, how many neighbors do you have, is given by n divided by m, m divided by n. Should m be up or down? Okay, m should be there because average degree should increase with the number of n should be here. Now, is this all? So let's see. If n equal 2, m equal to 1, what is average degree here? What is your average number of neighbors? 1. So that doesn't look good. Right. And that's a rigorous way to derive the relation. Okay? So essentially what you have when you draw a graph from GNM, this is a random graph, the connectivity, the average degree is 2m divided by n, and if you look the distribution of connectivity, it's very heterogeneous, it follows the Poisson law. Now you may ask, can I color such graph with Q colors? Here, when Q is 2, 3, 4, 6, 7. So 2 coloring is very easy. There is a polynomial algorithm. Starting from 3 or more colors, in general, this is an NP complete problem. All right, so can we do this? Well, I don't know. So people did experiments, and what they did was to say, fine, let's take, yes?
Will you say that two coloring is easy, means that it's easy to say it is colorable or not?
Yes, and if it is colorable, it's easy to... look, this is the algorithm. You take one guy blue, you color all his neighbors black because or red because you have no choice. Then the color, the other neighbor of the red has to be put black, and, blue. Are we using blue and red? Okay. So one blue, all his neighbors has to be red. There is no choice. Then all these neighbors have to be blue. There is no choice. So either this works, or this leads to a contradiction, and that's it. Not even if it is a tree. It has to work. Because if you put one color, it forces all the others to be... so two coloring is very easy. You have this. What kind of algorithm is called unit close propagation? It can be analyzed on tree. So two coloring is easy to decide. Starting from 3 coloring, well, this algorithm doesn't work because you start to have choice, and then at some point you have a combinatoric factor that kills you. Okay, so if you find a good algorithm, you have a Fields Medal and probably a Turing Prize and $1 million. So it probably means that there is no algorithm, or we are not clever enough. All right, so this is what people try to do. Since we are not good enough to solve the problem, they generate many graphs randomly with a fixed value of n, and then they try to color it by looking all the possible coloring. So of course, since this is a hard problem, you cannot do this for large n. So they did this, and for n equal to 20, they looked the fraction of graphs that were actually colorable with 3 colors. Okay? And found something like this. So obviously, when the degree is low, well, you don't have many neighbors, so you don't have too much constraints, so it's probably not surprising that you can color your graph. But it seems that most random graphs of size 20 are colorable, are 3 colorable if the degree is low. When the degree is large, when you start to have 200 neighbors, maybe it's not so surprising that it's hard to color. And in fact, you don't find any fraction of non-3 colorable. Silly me. And then, of course, people are working hard. They did 30 and found something like this. And, you know, they will try hard to go to larger and larger sizes. And, you know, maybe it was wishful thinking, but they noticed that it started to look a bit like a step function. So that suggests that maybe at large value of n for a really infinite graph, you have a phase transition. If the average degree is lower than 4.69 something, they are all colorable. If it is larger, they are not colorable with probability going to 1.
So what is that number?
It's where this thing cross. So far, it's just a numerical observation.
What over 69?
4, okay, that's a comma, but 0.69 something. So that's the average degree when you have this transition. So indeed, mathematicians were able to prove that there is such a number. It's a bit more complicated than this. You know, they don't know how to prove that this number actually converges to well, never mind. It's a long story. But this suggests strongly that there is a phase transition from colorable to non-colorable graph when n is going to infinity. Okay? So of course physicists started to be excited, and the same phenomenon happened in many such combinatoric problems, most famously in KSAT, case satisfiability, and the number is actually 4.26, but 27, I think, or whatever. All right, so question, can we try to say something on this problem with physics method? Can we try to compute this number? And of course, it's very easy to come out with a statistical mechanics problem. This is just the zero temperature version of what is called the Potts antiferromagnet. So if you're Hamiltonian, that depends on the set of, so let's call the variable S. So S are variables that are on each node. They can take any value from 1 to q. And if you're Hamiltonian, is the sum over all links in the graph of delta, or let's call it sigma. Sigma I, sigma j. Now you see that the energy for one configuration will be 0 only if you find an assignment from all the sigma I such that for every graph they are different. Otherwise this is counting 1. Okay? So this is an antiferromagnetic model because it forces each spins to have different colors. And once you write this, when you're done, you know, you will start to write a Boltzmann factor, and your Potts model is here. And if you can solve a statistical mechanics problem, you're done. For instance, if you find the energy when the temperature is going to 0, well, it's very easy to see when you're in the colorable phase. If the energy should be 0. If the energy is non-zero, you are not in the colorable phase. So if you solve this problem and you plot the ground state energy, you expect something like this. Right, the energy is 0, then it gets positive. That means good, you have done your job. You can do even better. You can try to compute the entropy of the problem. What is Z in the limit of 0 temperature? Well, if you're at 0 temperature, the small Boltzmann factor here is going to kill every configuration that is not a proper coloring. So Z is just a number of proper coloring. And log Z, well, will be the entropy, it's the log of the number of proper coloring. Okay? So we even expect something like, if you compute the entropy, you should have something like this. Right? Clearly, this is totally wrong. So you know. That's what it actually does, believe it or not. Entropy decay and then jump. And that was first understood by Rémi Monasson and Ricardo Zecchina years ago when there was a jump here. But anyway, yeah, if you know the entropy, you know exactly how many number of graph there is, of colorable solution there is. So this is just a statistical mechanics problem. Okay. Now, how are we going to solve it? So the trick is to look in the face of this graph and to realize that if you look very closely at a GNM graph, it really looks like a tree. And this is logical. If you start from a node and then it had, let's say, 3 neighbors, you look at their neighbors. You know, since you have put all these edges at random, what are the odds that there is another edge coming back here? Yeah, it's 0. When n and m are finite and they are very large, it will not happen. So probably it will look like this. But what are the odds these two have links that come back here? It's again very small. And in fact, as long as you are in you go to distance that have order, you know, square root of n, the probability to have a loop is close to 0. So up to distance square root of, well, log n, I'm sorry, up to distance log n, you have a tree. And this is the root of the method. We are going to use this. We are going to basically pretend we are on a tree. And of course, it will blow up, it won't work, and then we will invent something else. But that's anyway what we are going to do. All right, so such problems, such graphs, they are called tree-like graph. Or locally tree-like. Okay? And if you're a mathematician, you can work on these. You will realize that since you have here a degree sequence, which is a Poisson, this is converging to the so-called Watson-Gatson trees, and so on and so forth, a lot of beautiful math. Okay, good. So now let's move to the cavity method. All right, what is the cavity method? So, you know, the essence of the cavity method was certainly not invented by Mézard, Parisi, and Virasoro, but by Bethe and Pyers in the 20s, when they were solving such problems on trees. And it's actually almost a trivial observation. So here is how it works. We look at 3 sites. And there is a lot of things happening there. You know, they are connected to billions of people. We don't care. We just say, look, they feel a field, an influence coming from whatever was up there. Okay? And what happens? Okay, let's AJ. Okay. What happens is that because of this influence, this point can be found in color. So let's say there are 3 colors. In color 1 with probability C1i, color 2 with probability C2i, and in color 3 with probability 3i. Okay? And fine. So we have this probability. And let's say the same for this guy. We have a probability that it can be found in any of the Q colors. And the same for that guy. So this is a probability distribution over Q number, or if you want, this is a vector, okay, with Q component. It lives on a hypercube, you know, in Q dimension. It's normalized, so not every point of the hypercube corresponds to a probability. Of course, the sum of all the probability should sum to 1. All right, and now I'm going to ask what happens to this new guy here. And the trick is the following. These probabilities, these are the marginals, probability that this guy is assigned color 1, color 2, color 3, Same for this one and this one. In the absence of that guy, and my notation is actually not the one we use. This is how we note it. We put a little arrow here, J to L, K to L. And what this means is Vierge marginal of variable I in the absence of L. Yes.
Like condition on the previous colors, the colors of all 1/3, no?
Says who? No, but why? For instance, maybe I have a graph when one neighbor was forced to be colored to 1.
So it's like conditioned on all the guys above, or?
Yeah, that's what this thing is supposed to mean.
Oh, so it's
But of course, you will find that there is a trivial solution, which is all the psi's are 1 over q. Right? I agree. But this is conditioned to everything which is happening up there. Okay, and it's a tree, so whatever happens here is independent of whatever is happening here, and independent of whatever is happening here. Right? So there is a tree up there, a tree up there, a tree up there, and now I'm making a tree here. And I'm asking, what are the probabilities for this guy? Psi L of sigma L. Well, it's not really what I'm doing because, of course, later on I will add a new guy. No, let's call it A, J, K, L, M. And so really what this is the probability of this guy when this guy is not yet here. And if I can write this, then of course I can do recursion on the whole tree and so on and so forth. Okay, so that is the trick. So you write a recursion in terms of its partial probability distributions. We can then the cavity probability, and cavity is because you have made a hole, you have removed one guy from the full stuff. Okay. All right, the way to do this, to write the recursion, which is to write this variable in terms of these three variables. I mean, it's a triviality, but it has a name. It's called sum product algorithm in computer science. And belief propagation in also computer science. I think this name was invented probably by Gallagher, who was a student of Shannon. And this name was invented by Judea Pearl in the context of graphical models. And of course, physicists used to call this a Bethe-Peierls solution. And Bethe-Peierls is also BP, so it's good. So we are going to call it the BP algorithm. Okay, what is it? Well, very easy. Do it. Okay, so what is the probability that that guy is taking that particular color? Well, there is a normalization, of course. Let's call it ZL to 0. And then, well, it depends. So what we need to do is to sum over all the possible colors that the neighbors can take. With choices going from 1 to q. Of course, all this must be pondered by the probability that this guy takes this color. I to L. So J. K to L. And now we need to add the Hamiltonian, because of course, if this guy is blue and this one is blue and this one is blue, well, it's like, yeah, we'll not put this one blue. Okay? And what is the probability that I should put here? Well, the one I'm putting in my Hamiltonian is minus beta, and here I have sigma 0, sorry, what's the name of this guy? L. I will write it here. So we have a delta sigma I sigma L plus delta sigma J sigma L plus delta sigma J sigma K. Now you have a sum here of all possible choices of the neighbor states. And here you recognize the product. And even here I could write this exponential as a product of three exponential. Say it again? K, yes, of course. Thank you, Mario. Right? Sum, product. And the reason why it looks like this is because of this tree-like structure. Okay, by the way, this is the kind of algorithm which is used in error correction, and this is what we use every day. This is probably used right now between this machine and this machine in order to make sure that everything I say is properly recorded. It's something like this that works. But that's a story for another time. Et voilà. This is what it works on trees. And of course, you can just apply it if it is not a tree. It's just that it's not exact. Because if these two are correlated, well, I cannot factorize the probability measure into three different independent measures on each of the sites. But since they are very large loop, it's probably okay. Life's too short. And I'm going to assume this is true. So this is the way you solve problem on a graph. You run this algorithm. And once you have run it, well, maybe you will complain that you don't really want to know this thing. You want to know the psi I period or the psi L period. But that's okay, because once you have run everything, you know what is psi m to L of sigma m. Right? Once you have run the algorithm on the graph, and you reach equilibrium, you know every partial message. So you just, if you want to know what is psi L, it's exactly the same thing, but you need to have sigma L here, psi L O to L, and sigma plus delta sigma O sigma L here. Okay, but we use a full marginal. Yes. This is true for all beta. Yes.
Sorry, I don't see it. How that's the probability? This is the average value of sigma I, sigma J, sigma K.
Don't take my word for it. After the lecture, you take this 4-spin problem and you try to write the probability of this guy. You think very, very hard, and you will find that this is it. Yes?
How do we initialize the algorithm?
That's a very good question. If it is a tree, you don't care. Because you can prove there is only one fixed point, so it should be okay. Now, the tragedy is that when you pretend a random graph is a tree, you might be wrong. And at some point, we are going to see that there might be many solutions to this problem. And I'm coming back to this in 5 minutes. Okay?
Why is there a unique solution?
On a tree, because you can prove it. If you start to the leaf, there is a deterministic condition that goes to the center, and then you go back, and that gives you a fixed point. It's totally deterministic, and it's the only one that exists.
That's for the minimum number of colors.
No, I'm not talking about color. I'm taking just this algorithm here as a unique fixed point. Okay? So by the way, you can probably simplify this thing for the coloring problem, just writing the simplified form. should be able to do this from memory, but here it is 1 over z. Okay, product over all neighbors of, well, how do I want to write it? KLMN. Okay, so it's a product of all sites that are in the neighbors of L except O. This is mean I, K, and L. And here we have 1 minus exponential minus beta psi sigma L, and here we have A to L. Okay, you can do this little exercise of proving that this is equal to that. That's very easy. Because of this delta function, most of these things will not count, and and the expression can simplify to something that easy. Right, and if you are into 0 temperature limit, this is going to 1, so it's really 1 minus this. Even further simplify in 0 temperature. All right. Now, once you have these marginals, then you can solve the problem, and everything is good. You can try to compute the partition sum Z of the problem with these marginals. It's not so hard. There is a formula that works, and voila. So that's the cavity method, except this thing do not work for the exact same reason that was already pointed out. For low degree, you can actually prove that this is fine. It's actually rigorously fine. In fact, one way to prove that this is going to work is to show that there is a Unix fixed point on a random graph. If there is a Unix fixed point on a random graph, that is the same one you would have on a corresponding tree with the same degree distribution. These marginals are correct, and your estimate of the entropy is correct, and everything is fine. The trouble is once you start to have larger connectivity, well, you find many solutions. So what to do? And this is where the cavity method is becoming interesting. Sorry, you are going to tell me this again? It depends. So for instance, I don't know them by heart, it's essentially oh yes, I know actually. I think it's, for a regular graph, it's Q minus 1. So if you have a regular graph with average degree Q minus 1, there is a unique solution. This is called the unicity threshold. It's probably Q minus 1 as well for Poisson graph or Ardoshreni, but it's very close to us. Okay, of course, interesting things do not happen close to Q. But they happen when the connectivity starts to be close to Q log Q or 2Q log Q, and then you don't have unique solution. In fact, it's even worse than this. We have an exponentially many possible fixed points to these equations. Okay, we have billions of them. So what should we do? We should try to find the correct one, for instance. No. So we did something even worse. So the essence of the cavity method is here. What we believe is that the partition sum is equal to the sum over all solutions. Not really all, but never mind. Of the partition sum corresponding to one solution. So this is how we solve the problem. We run this equation. We look for all these possible solutions. For each of them, there is a way to compute the partition sum, and we sum them up. And then we believe this is correct. And in fact, this has been proven. Okay, it's interesting, but this is, that was the hypothesis of the cavity method, that we could decompose the whole Boltzmann measure into a sum over all measure that corresponds to a fixed point of BP. And this is true. For essentially all these problems, for sparse problem, it has been proved by Emil Conja-Auglan and Will Perkins, that Boltzmann measure decompose into sums of problems which correspond to fixed point of BP. Yes? Give me 6 more hours on the cavity method, because I'm going to speak about it 5 minutes more and leave everything in the mystery. But yeah, hint, we never do this. Okay, we do it without doing it. Of course, we are not going to find a given problem and to solve all solutions. In fact, it's worse than this. We don't know to do it. And it's an open problem to do it on actual graph. Okay, what we do is to write the probability distributions over probability distributions. And we have, for each site, instead of having one psi, we have a distribution of psi that corresponds to how it is distributed over all solutions, and we have a population dynamics. And there is a really complicated story here, which I don't want to go. I just want to tell you this. That's the trick. Okay? In fact, I will allow myself 5 more minutes on the subject. What we do is the following. Well, it's the sum of all solutions, but no one works with z, right? We all work with log z. So z is the same as exponential log z. And of course, we never work with log z either. We work with log z divided by n. Okay, good. So this is what we believe, that the total z is the sum of all fixed points of Billy propagation, we call them states, and they correspond to phases in the phase transition languages, of exponential n times the entropy density corresponding to the state. Okay, S alpha is just log of Z alpha divided by n. And no one like discrete sum either. So what we actually do is to say, we are going to integrate this over all possible value of S. Of course, we need to count how many solutions they have with this value of S. So this is called n of S, just a number. This is still true. Right? I mean, that's literally sum of our alpha is the integral over all value of S, and here I just count how many they are with this particular S. But again, no one likes to count numbers in StatMech. We like to count the log of these numbers, and more precisely the log of this number divided by n. So that is how we write it. So sigma of S is a log of the number of states divided by n. So we give names to this, and I think this one was mentioned yesterday by Gianfrancesco. It's called the complexity or the configurational entropy, depending on what you are looking for. If you are in a computer science company, you use this, and this is usually what is used for glassy people. And so you see now we have two kinds of different entropy. We have many, many, many solutions. Each of them, we count them. And the configurational entropy is just counting how many fixed points of Billy propagation I have that correspond to a given number of solutions inside. Right? And that's the trick we use. In fact, the way we do this, the cavity method, and now I will not tell you how it's done, because my time is approaching the end, so that was more a primer, is computing this thing. But since I want you to have fun and to see a connection with replica, I will tell you still one thing about how we do it. Okay, how do you do this? Well, of course you are doing this by not computing it, but by computing something slightly different. We introduce the variable m, and z of m is just the sum of this thing to the power m. Now, of course, you will tell me, well, I just want to know z of 1. Yes, this is true. But this is a good trick. Why? Because now this m appear here, rise here, it's there, it's there, and here you recognize when n is going to infinity that this can be computed by Laplace approximation. It's dominated by the max. Okay? So there is value of S that maximize this integral. It's not the one with maximal entropy, right? Because you also need to have many solutions corresponding to this entropy. So there is and S star is the one that maximizes this, and so then you realize that the log of Z is the extremum over S of this quantity. So Legendre transform. Right, and now I will leave you here with a nice, interesting factoid. I hope I piqued your curiosity and you want to learn the stuff. This is really close to a replicated problem, right? Let's look at the replica problem. In fact, we call it the cloning. And what we see here is that if you compute the log, the partition function of the replica problem, it's given by the Legendre transform of the complexity. That's a new interpretation of the replica method when it's Legendre transform with respect to the replica indices. It's telling you how many states or phases they are at a given value of the entropy. This is a trick that was invented by Rémy Monasson 20 years ago, and now I will leave you out of the blue. We stop here. But believe me, there is a way, a systematic way to compute all this quantity that works perfectly fine. And it's not so hard. And from here, you can start to see the connection with the replica. Yes? Now, of course, I have nodes where everything has been derived from 1 to the end. And I'm pretty sure Pier Francesco would like to make comment with replica here if you want. Yes.
You want that, so if you assume that you are in a state, in one of the states, and you have replicas, they are like abstracted within the state. So you can shift the parentheses from the outside to the inside.
Yes, indeed. Okay. I'm not sure how clarifying it is. This M is connected to the 1RSB replica method, by the way. It's the same M that you see. Please do. Good. So that would be a good introduction. All right. So if anyone is interested, I would love, I'd be very happy to have a one-to-one meeting about how this works. It's not as mysterious as it seems. That's not very complicated after all. And the whole trick is to compute this thing. All right. Now you're expert. I can move to Lenka. Can you help me here? And I will just tell you how it looks. Okay? So the whole trick is the following. We know how to compute the number of fixed points of BP at the complexity, or more precisely, the logarithm of S-Nogor divided by n, because this is what has a proper limit. And for each of these fixed points, it corresponds to a set of solutions with entropy small s. Right? So the whole thing is that many different phases, many different fixed points, all of them non-trivial, and each of them corresponding to a set of solutions. All right. Okay. Now there is no way I could go beyond what I've just said, except if I had spent the 3 whole lecture on the cavity method, which might have been a good idea. Actually, it's a fantastic techniques. But that was not, the task I was given, so I just wanted to give you a flavor. but since we are all in Les Houches, I can tell you where I learned it all. It was here in 2003. This is Marc Mézard teaching the cavity method, well, exactly where I am. You probably can recognize the same kind of drawing I was doing. And you know, all of us learned it here. Yes. Well, you know, at the time we had dinosaurs around and we needed big machine to project slides. And it, you know, back in the day. Yes. It's probably still here. Yeah. The chair is not the same. This door has been painted. Oh, yeah. The sign sortie is not there. And Mark has gotten some gray hair, probably since then. And everything I've told you here, oh, I didn't really tell it to you, I hinted. It's something that we have been working on with Lenka and Federico Ricci Tersanghi, Andrea Montanelli, and Guillaume Semerjian here in Les Houches in 2006. And I found back an interesting picture from 2006. I don't know if you can see who these two young students are. This is a young Mathieu Viard, who was a student. This is Lenka giving the student seminar. And these plots that you see here are actually complexities, sigmas of f, that he has computed during the lecture, during the month. We had 1 month at the time, so we had more time to learn. Yes, probably. We had a distinguished professor that you may or may not recognize here. Was not aged a bit. I'm really jealous. So Lenka was here, and she had a visiting spouse. That's me. All nice and with hairs and everything. And that's a very painful moment, 2006. Any Italian in the room? No, that's not the moment. That's a bit later. This is the missed goal of Trezeguet. So this is the exact moment where Italy became world champion in 2006. So this guy here is Italian. Some of us here. Yes, I'm not naming him. That was tough. And it's interesting. Everyone in the room, many of them I recognize are actually a big shot. Jack Raymond is a leading scientist at D-Wave now, for instance. So yeah, that was tough. So anyway, I hope it gives you some sense of the importance of this place. I mean, Les Houches was really, really fundamental for many of us. Okay, so I hope in a few years you're going to show this picture of this year, and that will be fun. Okay, so let's do a bit of, that doesn't work, a bit of science. All right. So what I'm going to tell you now in the next 40 minutes or so is, okay, so there is this nice method. What did we learn about the coloring problem? And hopefully I will have enough time to tell you how it's connected with what we are discussing in machine learning. So that I have told you, that's the Hamiltonian. That's the way a random graph looks. This is a proper coloring. If you are courageous, you can look hard at my slide and see that one of these guys is badly colored. So these are the same graph, and there is somewhere a link between two edges. And if you look one guy and you look his neighbors, it's going to look like a tree. Okay? Fine. Now I'm skipping all the computation and I'm telling you how things look. Now, what we learned from the cavity method is basically summarized here. Okay? When you increase the average degree, there are a lot of interesting phenomena that are taking place in phase space, in the space of all solutions. So here, think about this as a n to the q dimensional space of all possible coloring assignment. And a black dot means it's valid coloring. And if it's not a black dot, it means it's not valid coloring. Okay? So, of course, if you have absolutely no link, any coloring is a proper coloring. So everything here in the space is black. As you increase the average degree, so you have more and more constraint in your problem, you have less and less solutions, so this thing will shrink. Now, what is interesting, it is in the way it shrinks, okay? And you see here that you start to see interesting phenomenon. And what we have found is the following. It shrinks, and at some point it split into disconnected pieces. Each of these disconnected pieces correspond to a fixed point of BP. Right? So you really can think of BP as a set of solutions somewhere, separated from the rest. So the size of one component corresponds to the entropy of its BP fixed point. And the number of components corresponds to the complexity in log. All right, so there are a lot of interesting things that are going on here. So one transition is called the clusteric or dynamic transition, and it's the same transition that probably Francesco will mention. It's connected to marginal stability and a lot of things in glasses. It's when, well, you stop to have this big guy, and you start to see an exponentially large ensemble of different fixed points, or if you want, a group of solutions. Okay? Call it clustering because solutions cluster into groups. It's called dynamics because it corresponds to a moment where something is happening in the dynamics. And computer scientists sometimes call it the shattering transition because space of solution has been shattered in pieces. It's much more dramatic. We know exactly when this happens. You know, for 3 colors, it happens at connectivity 4, 4 colors at 8.35, 5 colors 12.84, and so on and so forth. It's actually something like Q log Q. We know to count how many of these guys there are. The logarithm of the number of big chunk of solution, we call it the complexity, looks like this, and then it decays, and at some point, you have no more big chunk of solution. When the last big chunk disappears, there are no more solution. This is the colon-col transition. This is the moment where the graph becomes uncolorable. And interestingly, what happens is that at the end, there is one big chunk that disappears just like this. But all the solutions inside disappear, and this is why you have this jump. As I told you, the entropy is discontinuous at the transition. It's because the last big cluster of solutions disappear altogether. That's a very important phenomenon. Maybe, or maybe I can't because I don't have time. But I'm sure you will comment about it later. Okay? So we know we have the colon-col transition here. We have been computed, and we for 4.69, we are all happy. That was obtained first by Andrea Pagnani, Roberto Mulé, and Riccardo Zecchina. And then we know all these numbers for all possible Q. And there is something else interesting here. At some point, we go from an exponential number of big chunks to somehow a finite number of them. It's not actually true. We still have an exponential number of chunks here, but they're all small. But if you pick one solution at random, from this point, it is in one of the 2 or 3 big clusters. We call this the condensation transition. And you have a condensation of the measure towards the biggest cluster. That means that if instead of counting the log of the number of clusters, you count the log of the number needed to cover almost all solutions, well, there are less of them, and this goes to 0 here. Starting from this point, we have 1 or 2 clusters, you have almost all solutions. And all these exponential many clusters that are still there, they are extremely small, they don't count. Okay, so you have these 3 different solutions here. And they correspond to, well, in replica parlance, this is a dynamical replica transition, this is a replica symmetry breaking transition, and we'll not go there. Okay? Yes? No, it doesn't. That's the beauty of replica method. You split into exponentially. And this is something we basically find in all these complicated problems. It's almost a universal truth of this thing.
What's the difference between red and black?
Very good. You are 2 slides in advance. But that's a fundamental one, and you will love it, I promise. Actually, 1 slide in advance. Because indeed, they are the black and blue. Sorry, black and red. I was once here with Giorgio, and he had something like black and blue, and he said black and red. And so I said, what is the blue one? It's the blue one. There are no blue. So I'm just doing the same mistake. So there are 2 types of clusters, and this is really fundamental to the, to the kind of the mathematical solution of this problem. So here is what it means. You have the red one, which we call the rigid or frozen cluster, and the black one, which we call the soft or unfrozen clusters. And what happens is that if you take all the solution, for instance, in this group, and you look at all sides, in all sides, it has always some probability to be at least in two colors. Okay? There are no sites that is blocked into one single color in this whole ensemble of solution. In the red chunk, there are some sites that have to be blue for all the solutions that belong to the thing. So they are really frozen into one color. Okay, the difference is clear? And so we call that it has a rigid backbone. You know, to be forced to have only one color, it's a complicated phenomena because if I'm needed to be forced in blue, it's because all my neighbors should be forced in all the other colors. Okay, so if you have three colors, I am forced to be in blue if my neighbors are, if I have at least one forced to be black and one forced to be red, then I have no choice. But if themselves are forced to be black and red, it means that they have neighbors that are forcing them so and so forth. So there is an interesting percolation phenomenon that is going on there with very strong forces which are putting strong constraints on the set of solutions. And we find with two different set of solutions. Of course, mathematically, we like the red one much more because we can write much more interesting equation, much simpler ones. So let's see what it means. For instance, if you look, you zoom to the graph and you look to what kind of colors are allowed in the set of solutions. Well, if you're in rigid clusters, some guys will be allowed only one color. A non-rigid cluster, well, everyone has at least two colors with some probability, even vanishingly very small. Right? So we have a third transitions at some point, which is a bit fuzzy because as the small clusters get smaller, at some point they become rigid. So this transition is something happening in each cluster, and then you can define a transition where a typical cluster gets rigid, or where all of them gets rigid, or the majority of them gets rigid. Anyway, so you have a rigidity transition that is going on here. And at this point, beyond this, all clusters are rigid. And now you may understand why a big chunk disappears at the end. Because the last cluster is rigid. It still has exponentially many solutions, but you put one link between two guys that were blue, and all this solution dies instantaneously. So this is why the number of solutions is has this discontinuous jump in the transition. That's actually a funny phenomenon. Okay, now you are expert in the phenomenon. So this is what that was our big contribution to science. Essentially, that was Lenka's thesis. I made this drawing with these exact bubbles. And for some reason, everyone picked up this one. Then I was starting to see it everyone. And I joked that this would be on my grave, like the S against A of omega. Okay, I don't have anything as fancy, but this thing is always is haunting me in my dream. It used to. All right, then you can do a lot of math. You can compute what the clustering transition is with respect of Q. You have all these nice things. When we did this, mathematicians were really excited. They tried to prove the result, and it took some time, about 10 years, and we had amazing contribution. Many others, and just singled out those guys because these are all dear friends. And very recently, Nike and Alan wrote this amazing paper with Jane Ding, the proof of the satisfiability conjecture for large K. This is not for coloring, but they did it for coloring as well. This is for SAT, satisfiability. And essentially, that they prove that there is a value of K, or in coloring, if you want, there is a value of Q, such that everything we just said is rigorously true. It's a major achievement. And they were nice enough to say that our proof relies heavily on insight from statistical physics, the way in which solutions break into clusters based on the so-called replica symmetry between argument, and so on and so forth. So that was a very very nice decade of intense activity between physicists and mathematicians. All right, so let me try now to come back slowly to history is nice, but that was 10 years ago. Let's try to come back slowly to maybe more pragmatic consideration. One of them is the following. So I just told you how many, what is the average degree at which you have no solution. Now, a totally different question is, can you find them? Of course, you can't find these solutions so easily because the problem is NP-complete, so it will not be fun if there will be a sample algorithm to find them. So let's try to see if we can guess at which degree you might have problems. Okay? In order to do this, let's have some fun. And let's think about the following problem. So you're on a rugged landscape. This is an island. Volcano Island, if you want. You're somewhere here. And because of global warming, what are you rising up? What can you do? All right. So we have some biblical insight on this. The first thing you could do is build an ark. But OK, maybe you don't have time. So let's look for an arkless strategy. That was the working title we had with Rory Kurchan for this paper for a while. Then we decided to have something more boring. So what you do? Well, you need to find a way to move on the island. So we use a wet toes algorithm. It's very powerful computational method. So you look at the sea, and where your toes are wet, getting wet, you just make a step backward. Let's see how it performs. So you're here. Okay, so you're here. What you should do is to go back here, and you're safe. Now, of course, this is stupid. What you really should do is to go to the highest point on the land. Okay, that's way too complicated. So we try to find a local algorithm. So you do this, but water keep rising up. So you find yourself here. So the first thing you realize here is maybe the island is splitting up into disconnected pieces, but that's fine. You are still alive so far. So the fact that you are disconnected doesn't mean that you don't find solution, right? And at some point, you have this thing. It looks like the dynamical transition. The big chunk in which you are is splitting into many spaces. You are still fine. However, at this point, you cannot visit the island anymore. Okay? This is a dynamical transition. It corresponds to the moment where local Monte Carlo algorithm have trouble sampling the whole space. This is why we call it the dynamical transition. Okay, so it's hard to sample, but it doesn't mean that it's hard to still be alive. I am here, after all. Then you have a smaller and smaller one, and then, of course, then there is a problem that, here you will drown. And unless you were extremely clever to be at the highest point from the start, you will not drown. You will drown before the whole land is covered. Okay? And finally, all land will be flooded. Okay. So let's see what it means. Well, it means that you don't care about dynamical transition from this point of view. If you implement this algorithm, the fact that things split into exponentially many states, well, you're still alive. Maybe condensation is bad, maybe not. The trouble is when your island gets flooded. This happens because of the fact that your island at some point have some rigid backbone, which means that if you want that it's a flat island, if it is flat, at some point water goes up and the whole island is flooded. Okay? When this happens in our set of solutions, well, if you are in a set of solutions that has hard field, and then, oops, you increase the connectivity, there is a new link. And then all solutions disappear. Okay? So that shows that the moment you have trouble actually finding solution to these, if you use an algorithm like this, when you try, that's actually an algorithm. You start with a random coloring, you add links, and every time there is a contradiction, you change things locally. That should work well until you arrive to this point where you are trapped in a cluster which is frozen. And if you have a frozen cluster, sooner or later, someone will send you a link between two variables with the same color, and all solution dies. And this is the moment where the algorithm stops to work. Right? So this is basically telling us that this rigidity transition is the moment where we should start to have problems, at least with an algorithm like this one, finding proper coloring. This difficulty is a frozen variable. So this is really, as far as we know, that's a deep truth. sounds ridiculous, but that's what we have found. In fact, we don't know of any algorithm that is able to find these frozen clusters. Because once they exist, we don't find them. The only way we know they exist is that we prove they exist. All the algorithms we know of, they find solution, we come to the black cluster. And it's obvious why, right? Because if a solution is in the red cluster, if you have made one mistake somewhere, well, you have a whole backbone of application, and unless you correct basically everything, you will not find the solution. So, of course, if you have something which is rigid like this, you know, errors are unforgiven. And that's the intuition we had before. That is the time needed to run the actual Wet-Toes algorithm for a coloring problem. And you know, when you increase the connectivity, so that's really what we do. You know, we increase the connectivity, and then once we have a contradiction, we randomly change the color around until it's okay. And you see that it's fine, and the time diverges somewhere before the uncoloring transition. This is for 3 colors, 4 colors, and the rigidity is there. So you see that, you know, we have this thing. So it's rigidity or freezing. Now, if any of you have worked on glasses, you should recognize this phenomenon. This is jamming. This is literally the same thing as jamming. Is when, you know, the jamming is really the continuous counterpart when variables are not discrete. But this is exactly what it is. So when you have particular jam, this one cannot move because this one cannot move, and this one cannot move because this one cannot move. Have your whole set of forces that percolate through the system. So this is analogy, you know, the equivalent of jamming inside discrete space. And you know, in the same way that jamming is a mixed first and second order transition, but the number of block particles, as you know, when it happens, start to have a discontinuity, and the number of change you have to do when you move a particle is also diverging in a second order way. We find the exact same thing here. Right? If you follow a cluster of solution, at some point, boom, a finite fraction of variables become jammed or frozen or rigid. And the time it needs to correct any flip is also diverging at the transition. So it's kind of funny that we have the same phenomenon. Okay? And that was exploited further by many of my friends, including Pier Francesco and Zamponi and so on and so forth. All right, but that was for one type of algorithm. I was doing something a bit funny here. I was starting from a problem without any constraint and adding constraint y by 1. That's not what you usually do. Usually you take with the full problem and you try to minimize the energy. Right? Actually, this is what we do in neural net. We do gradient descent. So what happens here? So of course we wanted to know, and we wanted to know what happens with energy landscapes. In all of these phases, how does the energy landscape look like? So again, there is a long story. There are a lot of tools to do this. The Parisi-Franz potential. There is a tool that we developed called the following state method. Then, of course, you might try to do some cat-race computation. We have no idea how to do them for this problem, so we used the hour method instead. And again, there will be hours to tell you, but I will make drawings instead. And this is what we found. For low degree, everything is central. That's how the energy landscape look like. So you start with a random point here. You do, well, you cannot do gradient descent here, right? It's not differentiable. These are all discrete spins. But let's say you do a Monte Carlo with a small temperature and you decay the temperature. You should have no problem finding a solution.
You cannot do the gradient descent on the probability.
Yeah, you can do it in tab space. Indeed, would work. Not bad. I will tell you what people do, actually, and it's funny. So, by the way, when I told you that everything split into exponentially, I lied. What happens is that first, the big chunk is still there, and you have an exponential number of very small clusters that appears. But that doesn't matter, because it still looks like this. You know, you have some minima that correspond to those guys, but you have still a huge basin that attracts the dynamics. And in practice, even though you start to have bad minima, you never see them. What about dynamic transition, the wall splitting? Well, it's the same. You still can go down pretty easily. Now, of course, once you are here, there is no way you can go up, back, and visit a thing. So you have a breaking of ergodicity. You have this thing we call the dynamical transition. But difficulty of sampling the whole space is not the same as difficulty of finding one minima. And in all these regions, what we so far understand is that it should not be so hard to find minimas, and it's not. So this is the result for the SGD version, if you want, or the Langevin version of discrete world. It's called the walk-call algorithm. This is what it does. You keep the list of all guys who are not happy. So for instance, I know that site number 7 is red and it has a red neighbor. So I pick up a new color for my guy. If with the new color is satisfied, good. If he is not satisfied, well, I'm still making the change with probability P. And then you have to tune this P. So it sounds a bit like a Monte Carlo method, but actually it's not, because it's really not respecting any detailed balance. For a while, I've been trying to think if it can be adapted into some kind of this event chain algorithm, but as far as I know, I don't know how to do it. But that would be amazing to have an event chain algorithm for this problem. Anyway, so you do this, and you have no problem. It takes longer and longer as the connectivity increases, but you see that the algorithm is going to zero error for a while. You see that's 4.5 for 3 colors. But these two things happens around connectivity 4, so you pass them. Same for 4 colors. But it takes longer and longer and longer to go to zero energy as the connectivity increases. All right, now we go to the real dramatic part. What is going on here? Well, now it starts to look like this. So it doesn't look really different, but hey, this is 2-dimension, and I did this with Keynote. So, but what I mean is that when you start to be after the frozen transition, the fact that you have contradictions is making everything more complicated. And now we start to have all these exponential kind of minima that Gerard was telling you about. And now every kind of dynamics we run is trapped into those bad guys. We don't find those guys anymore. And of course, at some point, you're past the satisfiability transition. There are no zero energy level, and you have these very complicated things that look p-spinish. In fact, they definitely look like a p-spin. And this is why we are so interested in a p-spin. Okay, you have these exponential local minima that are killing you. And indeed, you run walk call, you stay forever into that kind of plateau. Right? And the thing that seems to control the change of behavior is this rigidity backbone appearance transition. So that's what was the conclusion at the time. Rigid solutions are really, really hard to find. And when I'm saying this, what I mean is that even mathematically, if you look at every single proof that it exists of how we can prove an algorithm works and doesn't, and then empirically, like just running algorithm and trying to see what we can do, as long as you don't have too many frozen clusters, many polynomial algorithm works. Provably. Once everyone is frozen, nothing works. So we tried everything. We tried rigorous algorithm, empirical one, survey propagation, and so on and so on. Many, many clever things. We even tried quantum computing, mind you. We have a review on quantum computing for this problem. We don't know how to find this thing. In fact, there is a very important open problem in computer science here, which I want to mention. So 2 major problems. Well, can one design algorithm that actually find this rigid solution? For a while, we were actually scared that they don't exist, because we never found them. Then we invented trick, we cheated, there is a planting trick, so on and so forth, and of course our mathematician friends prove that they exist, and we know that they exist now. For small sizes, you can do exhaustive search, which takes exponential time, and you find them. But there is no polynomial algorithm that finds them, because they are the one hard to find. Very correspond to us. And here is open problem. It's called the Q log Q problem. So if the degree is 1 plus epsilon Q log Q, Q is the number of color, find an algorithm that probably can find a valid coloring for any epsilon larger than 1. It's probably worth a Turing Prize or something like this. As far as we know, right now there is no algorithm. So it's been a while that we try to cheat this, because we know that after Q log Q, the majority of clusters are rigid, but not all of them. So we try to construct very biased algorithm that finds a rare one, but so far unsuccessfully. But that would be really great if we could do that. That would be fun. So we could try to cheat this. But at some point, everyone gets frozen. It happens a bit later. And here, as far as we know, nothing works. And this is, people were asking in this business, where are the real hard problems for discrete optimization? These are the hard ones. Okay, we don't know to find this.
Have you tried deep learning?
Yeah, you bet people try that. Good luck. I mean, if deep learning managed to solve this one, I think it implies that P is equal to NP. That would be fun, and maybe deep learning can do this sorts. Okay, so now you are expert on this subject, except you don't know to compute this thing, but that's easy. Just read the paper. It's a good moment for questions. And then I'm going into very vague consideration of deep learning. Yes? Louder, louder.
So you have the C frozen and then before you have C, right?
Yeah.
And now, I'm always intrigued by these things by Campbell 16 on this big lab-based, solutions with high
Yes.
density. And one may wonder if this happens beyond C frozen, and I guess that it happens beyond C.
We know that there is a connectivity beyond which everything is frozen.
Exactly. And
So there, all these things cannot exist.
So
But yes, there is this thing that they may be very rare clusters that should be exploitable.
So the thing that we see, for example, in the Ising perceptron is between CGD and C frozen, where essentially all the typical solutions are rigid because they are just isolated.
Yes,
But then you have a layer one which has a big entity inside.
indeed.
And,
Right? So what he's saying is that this is the story of the typical bubbles. But there may be rare bubbles that do not behave this way. And of course, in fact, we know that this is the case. And the question is, can we exploit this? For this problem, we don't know how to do it, but that would be really fun if we managed to do it. Yes?
It's clear that if you want to find the frozen from the beginning, it's like you have an exponential of 1 out of exponential. But if you are already in a bubble, like a small one,
Yes.
you have one of them is the frozen one, and so you see it doesn't work.
Yeah, but I mean, it gets exponentially hard, right? Because if it,
Yes, but exponentially what?
well,
way fewer.
yeah. But you see, the trouble is, even the algorithm you have to correct, once you, okay, these two are red, what do you do? What we do is basically to start to run this work call algorithm locally. No one tells you that this algorithm is optimal and can find a non-frozen solution when there is still a non-frozen solution. So, and we extrapolate when we diverge a bit before. So our algorithm is maybe not good enough to find that. But yes, I mean, it sounds like you should be able to do it, but no one has been able to do it for discrete world. Of course, in the continuous counterpart, that's exactly what is going on. Right? If you adapt that kind of problem with local angles and everything, I mean, this is what we did with Roré and then, that's what the kind of thing that Pierre Francesco is doing, some continuous perceptron, and there's a lot of thought on how to unify this jamming picture with machine learning, and they use continuous variable, and then you really can go to the jamming point, okay? So the fact you really cannot really go to it seems to be a problem of this discrete variable. Okay, so back to machine learning. So the point is, I showed you this energy landscape, which is what we find when we solve these discrete problems. But the fact that, we found this because this is a structure of the replica solution, of the cavity solution. Essentially, for almost all problems that we know the cavity approach or replica approach works, numbers will be different, but we expect the picture to be the same all the time. And in fact, it is. Okay, that kind of things were actually first found in much simplified way in neural network with something called the committee machine, which is a really baby neural network. That was the work of Monasson and Zekina. Then people decided neural networks are boring, no one wants to study them, and then we all moved to CSPs, and we worked on this. And then there was all the people working on glasses and jamming, and again, and that kind of picture is always in our back. Okay, this is why I'm giving this lecture, because that's kind of what we have here in our mind, at least us, replica folk. Now, well, obviously, the same thing goes to happen with deep learning, right? How different can it be? So let's be a bit naive and see, if we just think that this is true, it's going to happen. So of course now we need to think, well, I don't have any colors here. Well, but you have things. You have variables that you try to solve, and you have more and more constraints. Okay? And more constraints and less freedoms means you have smaller network. Of course, no one wants to work with smaller networks. It sounds lame. So we want to work with larger networks. Fine. Voila. And now if we have larger and larger network, we have less and less constraint. And, I'm too old to make computations. I'm just going to say, this is going to look like this. Of course. So how stupid this is? It's actually, probably not entirely stupid. And what we really dream of is to have a solvable model where we can compute this thing for something that has 3 or 4 layers. And some reasonable model of the network and some reasonable model of data. And we don't know to do that yet. Okay, that's really something we really would love to do. But since I don't know how to do it, I will just make drawing and see what happens. Well, there is this moment where you have solutions, but if the network is smaller, you don't have any solution. That's a true interpolation threshold. Now, I'm a bit of a complaint for my friend using that kind of pictures, because they speak of interpolation threshold always, they don't mean this one. Of course they don't mean this one, because no one can see this one. You don't have an algorithm that works here, right? But when you talk about the capacity, and when you can interpolate all data, this is it. This is it. This is the one. But of course, you never see this. So in reality, that will be, that's what physicists will call the Gardner capacity, if you want. The moment where you go from under-parameterize to over-parameterize. But you never find the true minimum, right? Even in this, we have no idea to do this in machine learning, and we don't know how to do it in discrete optimization either. What we do is we run a particular algorithm with, which in this case is, for instance, walk call, and in machine learning is gradient descent, and you never find the true interpolation threshold. So probably what you find is something which is more an effective interpolation threshold, close to this frozen variable, or the jamming point, or jamming transition in learning. And indeed, this is what we actually see in practice. Under-parameterize and over-parameterize is somewhere here. Even though, strictly speaking, it should be there, you don't care about this solution because you don't find them. Okay? And so indeed, close to this frozen rigid transition or the jamming transition, you should go to a point where your network is large enough so that you can find minima, and before, you don't. Yes? Yeah, sure. They are universal things, but, for instance, I heard a lot of times, people talking about jamming transition as a Gardner transition, as a capacity transition. I had to correct a student of Andrea Liu because he was like, I have a new algorithm, and it's increased the capacity. No, you have a better algorithm, so you go a bit closer here, but the capacity of the network is a mathematical number. Okay? It might be totally irrelevant, and maybe we don't, in practice we don't care because we don't find it, right? But I think it's kind of important to have in mind that one is an algorithmic one, and the other one is not. In the same way, when you do jamming, jamming is not finding in large dimension the best random packing. It finds the jamming point, which is before. It's the one you can find with algorithm, okay? Which maybe is more important. All right, so is this wishful thinking? Is there, some kind of transition like this in real network close to a jamming point? And it seems that, no, it's not wishful thinking. In fact, there has been a line of work by many of people in the room who find that indeed there seems to be a moment where you go from over-parameterize in practice to under-parameterize, and it's connected to the equivalent of frozen cluster continuous time, continuous world, and it's a jamming transition. That was work of Mario Levent is here, Mathieu is here, and I'm pretty sure they are going to mention that kind of thing. Okay, so this is nice. That kind of spin glass, ideas and glassy idea is not totally out of the blue, and in fact, it seems to be giving analogies that are interesting. Of course, one of the most beautiful things that was found by our friends was the fact that close to the jamming point, you have degradation of generalization. There is a thing called double descent. So you have double descent behavior of the algorithmic interpolation threshold. Since they are too nice to say it, they won't, but I will. They found that much before anyone else. Okay, the whole community of machine learning is attributing this to everyone else, but this is not the truth. But the experiment and doing it in neural network. This is going on YouTube. Hello, people. That was found by them, and they should be cited as the origin before, Nakiran et al. And Belkin and so on and so forth. This is the first real double descent, clean one in the literature. So, cite our friends. So that's one set of ideas. Are there other interesting ideas that we could, wishful thinking extrapolate from this? Let's see. Well, if I have a super hyper duper overparameterized thing, everything should belong to one cluster, and it should be easy to go from one to the other. Is this true? Yeah, of course it's true. There are tons of work that are saying if you are super overparameterized, all solutions are connected. In fact, maybe even in practice, you can find many solutions that are connected. So if that kind of picture is true, you don't find those guys, so I insist that all these rigorous math work, they are mostly done in a regime which is really over parameterized. Okay, it's not true. Of course, they don't say this in the abstract, because in machine learning, everyone is overselling his result. But in practice, you don't know if this is true for a real network. Of course, you can make experiment and see that the solution you find are connected, which is not the same as saying all of them are connected. Right? A situation like this will be like one. All right, let's see. Daydreaming again. Well, if the set of solutions can be complex and you have things like this, not all of them should be equally good. Okay? There are rare solutions that are very different from the others. Maybe it should be possible to actually work hard and find solutions which are really zero energy and interpolate, and have bad generalization. And in fact, you can find them. That's an example of a work by Dimitri Aklioptas and collaborators, and they did something really fun. They randomize the label, and they learn. They go to zero energy. Good. Now they put back slowly the true label, and in fact what you see is that you are moving, your weight change very, very little, and then they reach a zero energy point of the new for the original problem. So this is fine, they have minimized the energy. It's a very clever algorithm. Except the generalization is terrible. That's interesting, right? So, bad global minima exist. But you have to work super, hyper hard to find them, which is kind of crazy. So I found this paper very interesting. Yeah, I love it.
Isn't there an easy way to find it?
You tell me. I don't know.
Get the test set, scramble the label, add it to the training set, train on that, find the minimum. Voila, there you go. These parameters give you 100% on training set and whatever accuracy you want on the test set.
Yeah. It's probably, in fact, this is basically what this thing is sort of doing, right? It's because since it didn't move, maybe it's still very good on the random. I know, because it's probably doing something like that. But you're right, yeah. I mean, I think there are many, many ways to do this. And I think one thing we should do is to work hard to find these bad guys, which is exactly what we should not do in practice. But I think it's interesting because it tells us that the landscape is more complicated than what we think. Okay, so this is the recipes. So I found this really great. Okay, last point. If you do CSPs, the solution found by solvers, they are really, really weird. In practice, we never find the red one, but even the black one we find, they never behave like if they would be, properly sampled from the probability measure. We all find rare solutions. It was connected to a comment that Pierfrancesco was making. In fact, in CSPs, we always find weird solutions that have very rare atypical behavior. And so that's the kind of thing that was used by Ricardo Zecchina and collaborator, and try to say, well, maybe this is the same in deep learning. There is weird, very rare set of solutions that generalize very well, and they are untypically large, and so on and so forth. And there is a whole set of paper by Turin / Milan School on this problem. And they even, use this to invent an entropy EGD algorithm. So there are some interesting ideas there, and it all came from originally from the CSPs.
In CSP, what does it mean to have an integral solution?
To have a what?
In CSP, what does it mean?
Well, for instance, you find a solution, then you may ask, I just spent the last 1 hour and a half to tell you that all solutions are a fixed point of BP. Fine, so I have a solution, I initialize my BP marginal in there, I run BP, it should go to a fixed point, right? In fact, Will Perkins and Amin Khojaglan proved that this, you can decompose the whole probability measure as a sum of the fixed point. So it should work. Yeah, good luck with this. In fact, finding, minimizing the problem and then iterating BP from something that you find never give you a non-trivial BP fixed point. In fact, finding a non-trivial BP fixed point is hard. This is crazy. We know this thing provably decompose into non-trivial BP fixed point, but the solution you find by solver are so atypical that they correspond to a very weird set of solutions that doesn't correspond to that. I mean, when we made the simulation, we were becoming crazy. And then we realized, okay, we are looking to typical things, and this is important, and that was really weird. So you have a lot of effect like this. But exponentially rare things for the equilibrium measure seems to be dominating where you actually end up with gradient algorithm. And that is, even here, it's really not yet fully understood. Okay, I think I will be over time, so I will conclude. And since I mentioned history, I will finish by mentioning this amazing paper by Philip Anderson, the creator of condensed matter and the inventor, one of the early inventors of spin glasses. He has this beautiful title, Spin glass as a cornucopia, une corne d'abondance, for the French people. And he was arguing very early on that, this thing that we are trying to solve, which at the time was a three-dimensional model of spin glass, might be useless. And in fact, as far as we know, is useless. Okay? No one has ever been able to find a single interesting use of a three-dimensional spin glass. It's totally useless. But as a model, understanding it will be fundamental and will give us way to understand a lot of things. And it certainly did. So I just, today was mostly about this and that. But there is a whole school of thought behind it. And before I really conclude, I just want to mention that Lenka and I are moving to Switzerland. It's a beautiful country. This is the EPFL. You have a view on the lake. That might be the Mont Blanc. And we are looking for talented postdoc and students. If you are not talented, don't write us. If you are talented, well, of course, feel free to write us, and we will be happy to talk with you. Okay, now I'm really done. Thank you for your patience, and thank you for being here.